Welcome to the second lecture in the Henry VIII series. Today we will be focusing on foreign policy in the first half of Henry's reign, by considering to what extent Thomas Wolsey was in charge of foreign policy between 1512 and 1529. This lecture will be split into 4 parts. The first section will examine Henry's early campaigns in France from 1512 to 1514. The second section will examine Wolsey's attempts to achieve prestige through international diplomacy between 1518 and 1520. We will then examine the causes of the diplomatic revolution, including the Battle of Pavia in 1525, which had a profound impact on foreign policy for the late 1520s. Finally, we will evaluate who was responsible for foreign policy during the first half of Henry VIII's reign, the king or the chief minister. Ultimately, who was responsible for its failure? Henry VIII was the very opposite of his father in terms of his foreign policy aims. He wanted to end the age of austerity and caution and embark on a new age of conquest and glory. He idolized the great Lancastrian king Henry V, who had won a victory against the French in the Battle of Agincourt. He also wanted to ingratiate himself with the nobility, and the best way to do this was to promise them adventure and glory. The English kings did have a territorial claim in northern France. This goes all the way back to 1066 and William the Conqueror, who came over from Normandy. In the 12th century, the Angevin kings expanded their territorial reach into the south of France. However, as a result of the 100 Years' War of the 14th to 15th century, the English kings had lost most of its territories in France. The only foothold they had left was the port town of Calais on the north coast. This was essential to both trade and defense of the English shoreline. Through marriage to Catherine of Aragon, Henry formed an alliance with her father Ferdinand, who was now de facto king of Spain. Ferdinand had ambitions to take the region of Navarre, which sits on the border between northern France and southern Spain. Military support from Henry would really boost Ferdinand's chances of taking the region. However, it would do next to nothing to boost Henry's chances of gaining land in northern France. Nonetheless, Henry eagerly accepted this opportunity to launch a campaign. In this way, we can see how Henry was naive as a young king and easily manipulated by Ferdinand. The campaign to Navarre was an utter disaster. You can see on this map the length of the sea journey that the English troops had to take to reach Navarre, in comparison to what would have been a very short journey over to Calais. When they arrived, the English tried to attack the French town of Guyenne, but it was too heavily fortified. Disease then broke among the soldiers on the overcrowded warships, and so they had to call off the campaign and return to England early. To make matters worse, when Ferdinand was later criticized for his campaign in Navarre, he claimed that he was honoring his alliance with England. However, Henry learnt from this mistake, and the following year he launched a campaign in northern France. This time, Wolsey was placed in charge of organizing the muster and the logistics of the campaign. And this time, Henry traveled over to France to lead the troops in person. The result was Henry's most victorious moment as king, the Battle of the Spurs. The English forces faced the French army in northern France near Thuran. Propaganda of the time hailed this as a resounding English victory. Even the name was a form of propaganda. The myth goes that all the English could see was the glint of the spurs attached to the boots of the French soldiers as they spurred their horses into a fast retreat. The battle was a symbolic victory for Henry, but in actual fact, it only gained him two small towns in northern France, the towns of Tournai and Thuran. This is a painting created to celebrate the Battle of the Spurs. You can clearly see the might of the English army surrounding the French army and the close, fierce level of combat. The towns in the background symbolize Henry's achievement at gaining Tournai and Thuran as a result of the battle. In actual fact, this painting is an exaggeration of the events. The French retreated before engaging in serious combat as they were outnumbered. They would have called this a tactical retreat, not a defeat in battle. In actual fact, there was a greater victory taking place on the Anglo-Scottish border. Due to the old alliance between France and Scotland, James IV attempted an invasion. This resulted in the Battle of Flodden in September 1513. In this battle, King James IV of Scotland led his forces against the Earl of Surrey's English army. The battle resulted in a decisive victory for the English, with James IV slain on the battlefield. Alongside this, it was a victory for Queen Catherine of Aragon, who was the regent of England, since Henry was conducting his campaign in France. When Henry returned to England, she presented him with the bloodied cloak of James IV as a trophy. The exact figure of the Scottish casualties at the Battle of Flodden is a subject of historical debate, but it is estimated that around 10,000 Scottish soldiers, including many leading noblemen. James V, the next Scottish king, was only a year old in 1513, and for a short time his mother, Margaret Tudor, was regent of Scotland. Henry could have capitalized on this opportunity and focused his efforts on conquering Scotland. But this would have provided him with far less prestige than a conquest of northern France, so the opportunity would go unexploited. Whilst Flodden did provide him with security from Scotland, this security was only short-term, and he would enter war with Scotland again in the final decade of his reign. By 1514 Henry had exhausted his funds and so needed to make a tactical retreat from France. He negotiated peace with the Anglo-French Treaty of 1514. As part of this, he offered his sister Mary in marriage to the much older Louis XIV. He also negotiated a pension from the French on the agreement that he would withdraw his troops. The French also allowed the English to continue to occupy Tournai. Whilst this may appear like a good deal for Henry, the maintenance of a garrison in Tournai cost the crown dearly, and the town was too small to gain economically from its occupation. Since England could no longer afford war, Wolsey looked to a new way for his king to gain prestige and to bolster England's position on the international stage. Instead of war, Wolsey urged Henry to seek peace agreements and to use diplomacy in order to hold conferences that would place England closer to the centre of European politics. As part of this era of diplomacy, Henry agreed to hand Tournai back to France in 1518. This is despite the crown spending £40,000 on new fortifications for the town and a new cathedral. This construction was ceased before the works were completed, since Henry had decided to return the town to France, which is another example of financial waste linked to Henry's ambitions. The Treaty of London in 1518 was a significant diplomatic event, where Henry negotiated a peace treaty among major European powers. Wolsey played a pivotal role in orchestrating the agreement, with the aim of promoting peace and stability in the region. His efforts were supported by the influence of the Pope, who endorsed the treaty as a means to prevent further conflict. The treaty marked a significant step in European diplomacy, as it established a framework for peaceful resolution of disputes and set a precedent for future negotiations. Some historians have argued that Wolsey used the Treaty of London to further his ambition to become pope. This is because he was given the role of papal legate during the proceedings and so was able to sign the treaty on the pope's behalf. To do this, he worked alongside an esteemed cardinal called Cardinal Campeggio, who you will learn more about when you come to study the break with Rome. By acting as papal legate, Wolsey was becoming a better known and more influential figure in the church, which would have placed him in higher esteem at the College of Cardinals when they were next to gather to elect a new pope. However, other historians argue that Wolsey's involvement in the Treaty of London of 1518 wasn't directly aimed at pursuing his ambitions to become pope. Instead, his role in negotiating this treaty was primarily focused on consolidating England's diplomatic position in Europe and maintaining peace among major European powers. While Wolsey was an ambitious figure in European politics and sought to enhance England's influence, his actions surrounding the treaty were more about demonstrating his diplomatic skill and securing Henry VIII's favor rather than directly furthering personal ambitions for the papacy. The second major diplomatic event took place between only England and France. In 1520, Henry VIII met Francis I near Calais. The event was organized by Wolsey as an official diplomatic gathering. However, in reality, it was a lavish event lasting 2 weeks called the Field of the Cloth of Gold. It received its name from the tents made from woven golden cloth. Both monarchs wanted to impress each other with their personal prowess. Henry was especially keen to show off their magnificent court and showcase England as a major player in Europe. There were tournaments, feasts and entertainment in abundance. The event was a grand spectacle that highlighted the rivalry and pageantry of Renaissance politics. As part of the event, the two kings engaged in a wrestling contest, which Francis I won. Rumor has it that Henry had the hump for the rest of the event as a result of this, showing that the event did very little to improve Anglo-French relations. In reality, it had a very short-term impact on foreign policy. Let's now examine the events of the mid to late 1520s. This was a period when England struggled to raise funds to join major military campaigns and so would become sidelined from European affairs. This was compounded by a fatefully bad decision made by Wolsey, called the Diplomatic Revolution, whereby England would change its allegiance in an ongoing war between France and the Holy Roman Empire. The 1520s was dominated by the First Habsburg-Valois conflict, so named after the two dynasties at war. Francis Valois, the King of France, fought bitterly against Charles Habsburg, the Holy Roman Emperor and King of Spain. They would be fighting over territory in northern Italy. When I refer to Charles Habsburg, I will refer to him as Charles V, which was his title as the Holy Roman Emperor. However, he is sometimes referred to as Charles I of Spain. When I discuss his troops, I will use the term imperial forces, imperial meaning empire, so linking to the HRE. Finally, I will use the term Anglo-Habsburg alliance rather than Anglo-Spanish, since Henry was now creating an alliance with more than just Spain. Henry was keen to reinforce this in the early 1520s, since he was married to Charles's aunt, Catherine of Aragon. Since Henry did not wish to be left behind in the Habsburg-Valois conflict, he discarded Wolsey's policy of diplomacy and reignited his alliance with Spain in June 1522, in the Treaty of Windsor. As part of this, he declared war against France and mustered troops for his third campaign. He also agreed a betrothal between Charles V and Princess Mary, Henry's only living child, who was only 6 years old. In actual fact, Mary would end up marrying his son Philip 32 years later. The third campaign is barely worthy of note, beyond its financial consequences. A fleet led by the Earl of Surrey attacked Brittany and sacked a town. Then in August the Earl of Surrey landed in Calais and joined up with mercenaries hired by Charles V. The plan was to raid northern France until the end of the season in October, but a shortage of funds, disease and bad weather saw the campaign end early. The whole expedition was completely futile. It gained Henry no further territories in France but cost him dearly. In 1523 Henry had to call Parliament and raise a subsidy to replenish funds. After his disastrous third campaign, Henry was not able to participate in the Habsburg-Valois conflict, and it is fair to say that he probably suffered from a fear of missing out. To make matters worse, there was a huge battle in February 1525, just outside Milan in northern Italy, called the Battle of Pavia. The battle was a resounding victory for Charles V that led to the deaths of many leading French nobles and the capture of Francis I. This essentially provided Henry with his best opportunity to take land in northern France. With only one problem: he had no money. As a result of the need to raise royal finance, Wolsey arrived at the amicable grant. This was essentially an illegal tax, since he could not ask Parliament for tax so soon after the 1523 subsidy, which had been used to replenish the royal coffers after the futile 1522 campaign. However, the amicable grant backfired, resulting in a popular rebellion in the town of Lavenham in Suffolk, with a rebel horde of 10,000 men. This was Wolsey's first major failing as chief minister, and he felt humiliated, as he was made to take the blame for attempting to find a solution to an impossible problem. Not only did Henry not have the funds to launch a full campaign, he was also let down by Charles V, who chose to release Francis I from captivity in exchange for a handsome pension. This shows that the Anglo-Habsburg alliance was far more important to Henry, and that Charles's main concerns were his war with Francis over territory in northern Italy. Desperate to get back into Henry's good books, Wolsey proposed a radical solution to his foreign policy problem. He persuaded Henry to switch sides in the Habsburg-Valois conflict and to forge an alliance with France. This was agreed in the Treaty of Moore in 1525. This became known as the Diplomatic Revolution. However, as part of this treaty, Henry had to publicly relinquish his claim to territories in France. Essentially, this meant he made a public statement of defeat. In return, France agreed to pay outstanding funds to England for Princess Mary, as widow to Louis XIV. As part of the diplomatic revolution, Henry was desperate to strengthen his alliance. At the time, Pope Clement VII was looking to form a Holy League to defend territories in northern Italy. This league included France and the Italian city-states of Venice, Florence, and Milan. However, Wolsey and Henry wanted this agreement to take place in London, so to bring England into the fold. When the other countries refused to hold the meeting in London, Henry felt thwarted and so refused to join the League. It would become the League of Cognac, as the treaty was signed in the town of Cognac in France. Even though England was not a formal member of the League, due to the decision to switch sides in the conflict, England was tied to whatever the decisions the League made. However, this was the wrong decision, since Charles V was winning the Habsburg-Valois conflict. This became painfully obvious in 1527 with the sack of Rome. This was when imperial forces took control and pillaged the city of Rome. As part of this, they took Pope Clement VII as prisoner. This would have terrible consequences for Henry, because 1527 was the year when he began to pursue an annulment from Charles's aunt, Catherine of Aragon. Charles had control of the Pope, and only a Pope had the authority to grant an annulment. To make matters worse, in 1529, Francis I and Charles V negotiated the Peace of Cambrai, where both made territorial gains and agreed to end the conflict. As part of this, Henry was allowed to send an ambassador to observe proceedings but had no active part in the peace agreement. By 1529, it was becoming clear that Henry was not going to secure Clement's permission for an annulment. This meant that Henry was not only isolated from big international decisions, but also foreign powers now held sway over something deeply personal to him. The decade ended therefore with Henry feeling bitterly angry, both at Charles V for manipulating the Pope and at his loyal servant Wolsey for failing to use his position in the Church to secure the annulment. It was this wrath that resulted in Henry stripping Wolsey of all his titles and wealth. In the early 1530s, he would seek a far more radical solution to his marriage problem, the break with Rome. This would of course dominate foreign policy for the next decade. It would be difficult to argue that Henry met his foreign policy aims by 1529. This is because he was too ambitious, and when he started his expansionist policy into France aged only 19, he had very little appreciation of how much his aggressive foreign policy would cost him. For a short time in the 1510s he was able to bolster England's prestige, firstly with his victory against the French in the Battle of the Spurs of 1513, and then secondly during the events of the Treaty of London in 1518. Where Wolsey was able to place England centre stage in European politics. However, by 1529, England still remained a second-rate power, shown by their exclusion from the Peace of Cambrai. Let's now go on to examine who was ultimately responsible for this failing. Was it Henry as the war-thirsty king who was hell-bent on reclaiming territories in France? Or was it his chief minister Wolsey who engineered every campaign, and also made two fatefully bad decisions in the mid-1520s with the amicable grant and the diplomatic revolution? Let's examine Wolsey's role first. He was the minister who broke away from Henry's counsel while the king was still a teenager and convinced him that victory against France was possible. He was the one who organized the 1513 campaign to France, which, whilst successful, cost the crown more than it gained in territory. It was also Wolsey who placed England centre stage during the Treaty of London, did that give Henry a false hope that he was now equal in power to Francis I and Charles V. However, it wasn't until the mid-1520s that Wolsey made his first big mistake with the illegal tax called the amicable grant. When this backfired, Henry lost the opportunity to take French land while the imperial forces held Francis in captivity. This then led to his second biggest mistake, the diplomatic revolution, where he convinced Henry to switch sides and support Francis in the Habsburg-Valois conflict. Essentially, this led to Henry backing the wrong horse in a race. Not only did England gain nothing from their new alliance with France, but Charles also now made it difficult for Henry to secure an annulment from his Aunt Catherine. If Wolsey had made wiser decisions in the mid-1520s, then England would have been less isolated on the European stage by 1529. For example, he could have provided cautionary advice to Henry and convinced him to act as a neutral party or mediator in the conflict. However, it is likely that if Wolsey had cautioned Henry against becoming embroiled in the Habsburg-Valois conflict, Henry would have ignored it. Throughout this 17-year period of foreign policy, Henry was determined to bolster England's prestige. He wanted this to be achieved on the battlefield, and when he ran out of money to do this, he wanted to earn it through being centre stage in European affairs. Henry was never going to accept no for an answer. Wolsey made it to the top because most of the time he was able to answer yes to Henry's demands. However, Those demands reached an impossibly high level by the mid-1520s, just as the royal treasury ran dry. Even though he had now been king for over 15 years, Henry still did not grasp the reality of the situation and continued to make demands. This would have devastating consequences for Wolsey when he failed to secure Henry's annulment in 1529. Henry would fire him and eventually replace him with one of his own protégés, Thomas Cromwell, who would give him what he wanted, regardless of the cost to the country. Let's now return to our overarching question of, to what extent was Thomas Wolsey in charge of foreign policy from 1512 to 1529? During the early campaigns, Henry was very much in charge. He wanted war with France, and Wolsey's job, especially for the 1513 campaign, was to make sure this happened. However, when Henry ran out of money, Wolsey suggested that he use diplomacy to gain prestige on the European stage. This suited both their interests, since the Treaty of London gave Henry the limelight he craved, whilst it also provided Wolsey the opportunity to receive promotion in the church with the role of papal legate. The diplomatic revolution was very much Wolsey's idea. It was a radical solution to the problem they found themselves in. They had run out of money, but Henry still wanted England to play a role in the Habsburg-Valois conflict. The gamble backfired and England was excluded from the peace negotiations that took place at the end of the decade. Therefore, whilst some elements of the foreign policy was down to Wolsey, the overriding key aims of aggression and prestige came from Henry. He set the agenda for foreign policy, and it was Wolsey's job to see it through. This means that the buck has to stop with Henry. If he had set out different aims or had a more realistic outlook, then his demands would have been met. Instead, by 1529 he only has himself to blame for the predicament that he found himself in. Thank you for watching. Please tune into my seminar to consider how you could use this lecture to structure an exam-style question.